Sam, go ahead with it.
Okay, welcome everyone to our SDAP sessions. And today we will be discussing Hadoop 101 and Hadoop ecosystem. Hadoop 101 would be a very introductory part to the Hadoop, going through few basic things. Okay, and then we will quickly have a look on the Hadoop ecosystem or Hadoop, the whole Hadoop family. Okay, we will not be going into details of any one of them, just a overview. In the following sessions, we will try to cover as much of each of the components from the ecosystem and go in depth of them. So, to starting with Hadoop, everyone, in a layman terms, at least knows in a point that Hadoop is used for big data. Okay, just in a layman sentence. So before starting to understand Hadoop, we should first look at what is actually a big data. How can you say that, okay, this piece of data is a big data? Okay, so, sorry. Yeah. So the first point would be what makes data big data. So trying to define a big data, it can be defined in like a data set is considered big data when it is too big in size or complex to be stored or analyzed in a traditional data system. So the few key points here is that the data is too big, and too big means we are talking about TBs of data per day. Okay, and the relationship between the data or the data format or any other thing which defines data is too complex to be, stored properly in the traditional systems. And if we go into the processing of that data, that becomes much more tougher job. So that's how you can see a big data. If it is very big in size and complex to analyze or store in traditional data systems, we can say that okay, now we are dealing with big data. Moving on, big data types. Basically, there are few types of data which you can see in the world right now. Okay, the first one would be the structured data. That means that data is having some strict format, or you can say that having some schema defined to it in a proper format, which makes it easier to store in a traditional system using rows and columns. But that data only makes 10% of all the data which you will be generally dealing with if you are dealing with some real world examples. The other type is semi-structured data. In this kind of data, there is some format at some level, but not entirely. Not that easy to convert it and save it into the traditional systems, but it can be done because of the some level of organization is present in the data. And for example, of these are like JSON. Okay, these kind of data which actually can be transformed into to be stored in traditional data stores. Okay, and that also makes only the 10% of the data. The majority of the data, it's almost 80% of the all the data you see would be unstructured, which means that there would be no logical structure between the data. The relationships would be very tough to find out. Okay, and it's almost impossible to flatten them into to a specific schema or format which can be stored into in form of rows and columns. Okay, and that makes 80% of data. So you can imagine that the amount of data we are dealing, the major part of that data is unstructured, which cannot be stored in traditional database. Moving on, the defining big data, there are few methods of defining it, but in the starting days of big data, people used to define it by uh, three V's. Okay, so these are they started to call it as the V's of big data, three V's of big data. Okay, so those were the starting days, and because of these three things which actually characterize the big data, the volume of data, which is self-understood, that the quantity of data you are dealing with. Okay, and so any solution or any kind of system you are trying to build, you have to consider these V's: the volume of data, what quantity of data you are going to deal with, and your further decisions will be depending on that. Velocity of data, so that means that how quickly the data is produced. So it can be variable. It can be variable means at some point of time, in some point of day, the velocity of data getting into your system is too high, and at some point of time it would be too low, and you have to adjust your system accordingly. Okay, and for example, if you are doing some processing with the data, the velocity plays an important role, because at some point of time you have to increase or decrease your system capacity to handle that kind of big data generating at that speed. The third point is variety. So how diverse the data is. I mean, if you try to understand, let's say data is generated from some web logs, data is generated from some IoT devices, data is generated from some network devices. Okay, so all the data coming to you from different places have different formats and there could be different ways to handle these data. So designing a system, you have to consider the variety of data you are dealing with. The more diverse the data is, the more processing you have to do before you store it or you deal with it. So variety becomes one of the important part of big data. Okay, so initially they started with three V's only. Because of these three characteristics starts from V, so they started saying it three V's. But what happened that in the industry, it became a competition to come up with more number of V's. Who can define big data with more number of V's. I have read somewhere that some system, I think the Oracle or somewhere, they come up with 42 V's of big data. Okay, some define with 5, some define with 10 or 9. Okay, but these four, I feel, I found these four are little bit more, related to, what we do and how to deal with big data. So I included this into this one, and these are now called the 7 V's. So, I can say that, okay, big data, there are 7 V's: volume, velocity, variety, and then veracity. Okay, variability, visualization, and value. Veracity is basically the reliability of your data source, actually. So the data source, the data source can be just pumping out data. They can be doing some processing and then pumping out data to you. They can be storing data somewhere and then pumping out to you. So all these factors come into picture when you talk about dealing with big data: the reliability of big data, the reliability of the data source from where the data is coming to you or in your system. Variability can be related to the variety also. Okay, so the how consistent the data values are, so if every time the consistency is not there, you have to write different kind of processings for each kind of data, and that increase that may drive some other decisions in your solution designing. So variability of data values which are coming and how to handle those variability play a big important role while designing a big data solution. Visualization, every time we design a solution, we have to think about what questions we can ask from the data we are going to store, and how easily it can be visualized in some way. Okay, so that's the visualization part. And the values are basically the derivability of values from the data. How easily it's easy to derive the values which you want from that data. Some data can be very you know natural language processing or NLP kind of data. So the derivability of values from that data is not that easy. Whereas in some data where straight logs are there, and if you have to uh, have a consistent format into that, that it would be date and then the name of the user and XYZ. So that derivability of the value is much easier than compared to a natural language processing system. So the value also plays an important role while designing a solution or dealing with big data. So these 7 V's are basically the characteristics of big data. And now if we understand this, we can think of the complexity of handling or complexity of making such a system or designing such a system where these kind of data can be handled in a proper way, in a scalable way, and in a fault tolerant way, because data loss is not accepted anywhere, in normal scenarios. Okay, so what I mean, I was keep saying that, I mean, the data cannot be stored in traditional systems, but what's actually is the problem with the traditional system? Why it cannot be stored in that? And one of the major problem is that the volume, the first V which we talked about, that becomes one of the major problems, because vertical scaling has limits. You keep on adding hard disk, you keep on adding the processors into your stack, but it reaches a limit. I mean, you cannot keep on going with that. And that deals with, I mean, if you're dealing with TBs of data per day, you cannot keep on adding hard disk by hard disk every month or every week. And the manageability of those stacks are also come into picture. The major point was the disk seek times. If you keep on adding this, stacks on your data center, and the data is keep growing, with traditional data systems, disk seek times is increasing as per, I mean, it can be directly proportional to the amount of data being stored. So disk seek time plays a very important role, and that's one of the major challenges. And definitely, I mean, the disk times are higher, the processing times tend to go higher, because the data you want to process, you're not getting at the same speed on which you want to process them. And the major problem is the hardware failure. We keep on adding hardware over hardware in the stack, and if the hardware fails, what will happen to that? Because we are vertically scaling. So these are the problems which were there, and it in the industry was trying to find out some solution that how these things can be handled. It's just not going to, it's not a sustainable way to survive like this. And also the machines or the servers which people used to buy and to store the good amount of or big amount of data are quite expensive. It's not commodity hardware which you can buy and store your data into that, because the everything is to the hard disk, the CPUs, all things come into picture, and that makes the machines expensive. And with time, the real-time processing also started to come into picture, and that becomes more challenging with the traditional systems. How to manage this real-time processing, the big amount of data flowing, and you want to do processing at that point of time and then storing, or maybe doing something after the storing and then pulling it back into a stream and processing like this. So these challenges will keep growing. And it's a general understanding developed everywhere that they need something like distributed storage, where they can store in a distributed format with some not specialized hardware, and they can grow with the amount of data. I mean, if the data grows, they are able to grow with that, because uh, it is kind of horizontal scaling. So you keep on adding the machines, but it stores data in a distributed way. So if something fails also, or every machine is independent of each other kind of thing, so that the seek times or processing times are less. And then the second point was distributed processing. So when you store data in a distributed manner, uh, that doesn't make sense to bring all data into one kind of a system and then process it. So distributed processing have to have happen, because the data is stored at, let's say, machine 1, 2, and 3. The processing should happen at machine 1, 2, and 3, and then the data would be returned, and then there would be some mechanism to represent it in some way. So these two concepts, distributed storage and distributed processing, started to take uh, roots in the industry. Okay, and that's where all these big data systems started to grow up. Okay, and I will come to that point. So yeah, with this concept, I mean, if we have to define Hadoop, we can say that it's an open source software platform for distributed storage and distributed processing for a very large data sets on computer clusters built from commodity hardware. So definitely, I mean, Hadoop is a software platform. The two things which were the two concepts which were discussed, like distributed storage and distributed processing, are handled by them. Okay, and very large data sets can be handled because of these two things. And the cluster, and then the cluster which is made is built from commodity hardware, not specialized hardware for saving big data. So any commodity hardware, you can which are relatively less in cost, you can keep on adding them as your data grows, and you are able to store a very large amount of data and process it also. So that's how I mean, that's the way Hadoop can be defined. Okay, before jumping into Hadoop, let's uh, see the inception and the evolution of Hadoop, how it all started and how it happened. Okay, so what happened that in 2002, Yahoo was started development on a search engine called Nutch, and Doug Cutling and Mike Caffarella started that project, and they were also working on mechanisms to uh, save the search engine requirements on a distributed way. Okay, and they were working on that, and meanwhile Google published a white paper specifying a Google file system, which becomes the basic of HDFS as we currently know. Okay, so they published a paper where the concept were storing data into, breaking data into small parts and saving it into very different file system. As for a client, it seems like a big hard disk, but behind the scenes, it's distributed into different hardwares. Okay, and in 2004, Google published a white paper on MapReduce, the way to process data which was stored on GFS. Okay, and Doug Cutling and Mike Caffarella took these concepts. They were already working on to find a solution for such things. They took these two concepts, and I mean, till now, I mean, HDFS is called as an open source version of GFS. So they took these two concepts and started implementing for Nutch, and they said that NDFS, this Nutch distributed file system, and MapReduce. MapReduce, they don't change the name because the name was not, kind of a name like GFS. It was just a concept of mapping and reducing. So they started using that, and in 2006, they started Hadoop as a sub-project of Nutch. Okay, and in 2007, they started testing this Hadoop system, HDFS and MapReduce system, on a cluster of 1,000 nodes. Okay, in 2008, this the sub project of Nutch becomes a top project in the Apache. Okay, in mid 2008, Hadoop defeated some supercomputers because of the processing speed and the amount of clusters you can have there. Okay, in 2011, the first version was released, and this version was only having HDFS and MapReduce. In 2012, Hadoop 2.0 was released, which was with Yarn. Okay, so now this resource negotiator was included into that. Okay, until that point, I mean, this forms the foundation of all the ecosystem or all the system about big data what we see today. It's all started with having Hadoop 2.0, which was having HDFS as a storage, MapReduce as a processor, I mean distributed processing, and Yarn as a manager or a resource negotiator. In 2017, they released the version 3, and in 2020, it's currently version 3.1.3. So this was how Hadoop came into picture. Okay, so I mean, if you see, it's just the concept started from Google itself. Yeah. So moving on, I assume there are no questions here. I mean, please feel free to stop me anywhere if you have any questions. Okay, moving on. So the Hadoop, I mean, I will be calling it Hadoop native because in the current ecosystem, it's really need to understand what is part of Hadoop proper and what is built or built over this Hadoop in a tightly coupled manner. So we will come to that. But to start with, Hadoop has three parts, which I just said. HDFS, which was the distributed file system. Okay, and this was used for the distributed storage. Yarn was a resource negotiator. Okay, spelling mistake here. Yeah, I mean typo. It's a resource, yet another resource negotiator, which manages the nodes and the task and the workers, how to manage that. These all things are handled by Yarn. Okay, MapReduce is the mechanism for distributed processing. Okay, and let's go quickly into just to understand what these things are at a top level. I know, I mean, there can be very deep discussions on this point. I just want to cover it out so that we can have a basic understanding to move forward. Okay, so looking at HDFS, so the basic concept of HDFS was that you have a big file or big data coming into you. Okay, and that data gets broken into smaller blocks, and these blocks are not that small. Each block can be of 128 MB. So if your data is less than 128 AB, it may go into only one blocks. But if the data is big, it is broken down into smaller blocks of 128 MB each, and then it's been stored on different nodes. Okay, and while storing the different nodes, the replication is also taken care. So which means that each data is not necessarily residing on only one node. It may be residing on more than one nodes. Okay, so in this way, the big data was handled, that any big file or big data coming into it's broken down into 128 MB blocks, and each block is stored and replicated into different nodes. Okay, so just looking at a small architecture. So in HDFS, there is one name node, and there can be many data nodes. Data nodes are where the actual data resides. Okay, name node handles the name nodes actually stores some information about the data, where it is stored, on which node it is stored. Okay, and so I mean, if there is a client who wants to communicate or to get or write data into the data nodes, he connects to the name node and asks him where is my data stored or where to store my data, and name node then handles it specifically. The important point here is that there should only be one name node. It cannot be more than one name node, because if there is more than one name node, the client will not be able to come to a consensus that data is stored where, because it's highly distributed and data can be at more than one data nodes. So it's really important that name node should be one. Okay, so let's see example of reading a file. What happens that when a client node tries to read a file, it connects with name node, okay, and ask about that. Okay, I want to read this file. How should I get it? So the name node responds with that your file is stored into these 1 and 3 data nodes, and then you connect with data nodes and get the file out of it. So generally, the process which I'm saying is done by a client library. You don't have to worry about what you will worry about calling a client library to fetch a file, and it will return you a file. But internally, what it does, it connects with the name node, get the information of where the data blocks are stored, and then fetch that data blocks and then present the file to you. Okay, and while trying to write a file, you tell the name node that I want to write a file. Okay, name node tells you that, okay, you can go ahead, you can write the file on this data node, and this data node then takes care of the replication, and the response of the replication successfully done is returned, and then this metadata information is shared with name node that this file is stored on this one and replicated on this one. So this kind of metadata is sent to the name node, and name node stores it in some big table format. Okay, so when the next time you come and try to read a file, it will read it there and say that, okay, your data blocks are stored on these nodes. Okay, so this is basically the working of HDFS. So, I mean, there can be a question that I am saying that the name node should always be one. And if the name node is only one, there is a single point of failure, right? I mean, if it is a single point of failure, then how we can handle that? So there are few concepts for name node resiliency. Okay, so the first one is backup metadata. I mean, does anybody knows about this? I mean, how to handle this name node resiliency?
No.
Okay. So basically what happens that name nodes maintains a commit log. Commit log means, I mean, every event which is happening or every action which is taking it maintains a log file, and it keeps it in the native storage of that machine. So the backup metadata says that, I mean, either you back up that storage to somewhere or make it to write to, NFS or something like that, where it can be, even if the machine goes down, that information is still there, and any other node can come up and start reading from that commit log and move on with it. So that metadata is the important part of the name node, which is the stores. And because if this is lost, I don't know how you can take out data from your HDFS, because this is the only place where you know that, okay, this data is stored on this blocks. So backup metadata is one of the strategies. The another strategy is secondary name node. So secondary name node means that another machine which is already at a kind of a standby and reading the same logs which is written by the main name node, but this secondary name node is active only when the older one is down or something like that, because two name nodes cannot be active at same point of time. So this stays at a passive mode, doesn't do anything. But once the main name node goes down, okay, and then because it is also using the same commit log, it can come up and start doing the job. So that strategy is a secondary name node. The third strategy is HDFS federation. So this federation means that you have some metadata information with you add some metadata information with the data itself, and you can say that, okay, this name node can handle, this namespace of data. There is another name node which can handle this namespace of data. So by doing this in a way, you can handle the name node going down uh, in some way. So that's what HDFS federation is. The third is HDFS high availability. And this is where the Zookeeper comes in. Okay, and Zookeeper handles the failure of name node and bringing it up when it is required. And generally, it tries to keep a hot standby. Okay, with the shared commit log. So the switch happens if one of the nodes goes down. But in this case, Zookeeper takes very specialized measures to have only one name node active at any point of time. There is no way to connect to the standby name node, and that is taken care by Zookeeper itself. So this is what HDFS high availability is. Okay, moving on. So we checked this HDFS. Now let's quickly look at the MapReduce. What MapReduce does. So the basic flow of MapReduce is, by the name itself, you can see that it's a map and a reduce. So what happens that the input data, which is stored on HDFS, okay, a mapper function runs on that data, okay, and the main job of that mapper function is to extract and transform data in a way that it can be recognized by a key and some values. Okay, so it tries to transform the data by key. So now you have a key and you have some data. So every map function you write, you have to specify that what is the key and what can be its values. Okay, and this mapper function actually extracts data for you, and now data is in a format where you can process it. So after this mapper function, this shuffle and sort step is actually is a default step. It always happens after the mapper. Okay, you don't have to code it, but it always happen. And what it does actually is that because it's a distributed system, right? So the different keys can be at different nodes. So what it does that it shuffles the data a bit, okay, and have data related to one key at one node, okay, and then sorts it. This step is important because this gives reducer the reducer don't have to go to many different places. For one node, one key will come out. From other node, another key will come out. And then the job of the reducer is to aggregate those output, and then the final output of that processing is produced. Okay, so only if you have to remember, you remember with the three things: mapper, shuffle, sort, and reducer. So this is what actually the MapReduce process is. The benefits of MapReduce is actually I specify like this. It's a simplicity, because you can write as we discussed, the amount of big data we have and the amount of unstructured data we have. With using MapReduce, it's much easier to process that data. So the simplicity is there, and by using this Java and Python bridges, you can actually write a good amount of code to fetch some really complex data and do some processing on that. Scalability comes with HDFS because the process is distributed. If one node goes down, that data is residing at some other node also, or some other data blocks also. So the processing happens in that way. And if there is a need to increase that processing, you have to scale up scale out horizontally, and you can handle it. So the scalability with MapReduce processing huge amount of data is already there. Speed, definitely the speed comes into picture, because using MapReduce, you can actually process data which with traditional systems needs days to process, can be done into hours or even minutes. So that definitely a big factor. Okay. And fault tolerance, as I said earlier, also the data is stored at different places. So if one node goes down, you doesn't lose anything, because data is already replicated and the processing can be done on that part also. So these are the I feel the main features are, and I remember them with S3F. So I mean, if I have to define the benefits of MapReduce, I would say S3F: simplicity, scalability, speed, and fault tolerance. Okay, so just quickly, let's look at try to understand how this works. So basically, what happens that input. I'm not sure I understand. The input data comes at, okay, and it's stored on different nodes, and these nodes are running this mapper task. Okay, so for example, this K1, K2, K3 are keys, and V1, V2, V3, V4, what is there are the values. I'm just giving a simple example to make it clearer. Okay, so on node 1, while processing, we have K1, K2, and again K1. And this can happen. One node can have more than duplicate number of keys with different values. Okay, so here it doesn't do any kind of thing. It just processes. For K1, this is the value. For K2, this is the value. Again K1, this is the value. Again K2, this is the value. And this thing does on every node on which the mapper task is running. Okay, and after this step is actually the shuffle and sort. So what happens that if you see the output here, the K1 comes it on node 1, we have K1, V1, V2, V3. But originally, the K1 and V3 was only at node 1, and K1, V2 was at node 3. But after shuffle and sort, on node 1, we have K1, all three values of V3, which are from different nodes. Similarly, for K2, if you see K2, V2 is on node 1, V3 was on node 2. Okay, but here we have K2, V2, V3, all the values of K2 is on one node. Similarly for K3. So now if the reducer have to run, so reducer will run on this node, and for each key, it will reduce or aggregate whatever information it gets. So in this example, let's say, for example, I'm saying that this reducer is a function of length. So the length of values. So after the reducer run, you can get K1 equal to 3, K2 equal to 2, and K3 equal to 2. Okay, so this is the MapReduce is running, and the output will be that K1 is 3, K2 2, K3 2. So this is how the distributed processing of or cluster execution of MapReduce happens. If you look at some in another way of how the node manager does it, so what happens that as soon as the client requests to run a MapReduce job, Yarn spins up a application master, which is called MapReduce application master. And this application master is responsible for handling the worker task, on which nodes the worker task will run. And if a node goes down, how to spin up a new node to handle that task. So this is all managed by the application master. And the application master does one more thing, is it tries to run the mapper process as close to the data block as possible. So it tries to run a mapper task on a machine which actually stores that part of data. Okay, so I can understand it's not possible all the time, but it tries to do most of the time. If possible, it runs the mapper task on the same data node where the data is actually residing. Okay, so and these nodes are actually reading from the HDFS, the file system. Okay, so what happens that so this application master is actually the watcher of each mapper or reducer task running on different data nodes. Okay, and then what happens if the application master goes down? Who is watching the watcher? So definitely Yarn is watching it, and as soon as the application master goes down or the whole node goes down, Yarn spins up another application master to handle the data from there. Okay, and what happens if the Yarn goes down? Here, the zookeeper comes in. The zookeeper tries to look for. I mean, if the Yarn is going down, then goes down, then it starts up a new resource negotiator, and then from there it starts again. So that's how MapReduce work. Any questions till this point? Okay, moving on. So yeah, so now, I mean, if we understand the Hadoop, we understand this big data, and we know that this HDFS and MapReduce actually form the foundation of the whole Hadoop ecosystem. Okay, and Hadoop ecosystem is still growing, and I mean, if I have to put every technology currently working with Hadoop into a diagram, it would be very complex one to handle. I would try to keep into what I understand and what I have read from all the sources. Let me try to do this. So starting is the Hadoop core ecosystem. So most of the places they say that this actually forms the Hadoop core ecosystem, in which these are the Hadoop, Yarn, and MapReduce are the Hadoop proper or Hadoop native. Okay, and then there are other systems which are very tightly coupled with these three here. Okay, so starting with Hive. So we talk about that MapReduce is definitely simpler to write some programs to handle complex processings, but still it not happens that every type of data or every form of data is easy to write a MapReduce function, write a mapper function, because it's not necessarily that every time you will be able to get to those keys, and extracting that values can be very difficult. Okay, even with the bridges like Java and Python. So Hive came into picture, and Hive actually provide the way to write SQL queries. So with Hive, you write SQL queries, which are eventually converted into the MapReduce jobs, and which are then handled, run by the MapReduce as usual. So the Hive, the query language is called HQL. Okay, which is very similar to SQL queries. Okay, and you write SQL queries, the HQL converts it into different MapReduce processes or MapReduce's jobs, and those jobs are run into with the MapReduce and with Yarn and HDFS. So Hive is quite tightly coupled with the Hadoop native. The other similar way of querying the data is Apache Pig. Okay, Apache Pig provides a scripting language called Pig Latin. Okay, so you do in a you do, I mean, similar to SQL, you can write scripts, okay, or statements which can be run on the command or as a full script, and it's basically step by step process of querying or fetching the data. So What Pig does, it also interprets your Pig script or Pig Latin script and converts it into the MapReduce process and does the execution accordingly. So this is one another way. It's quite similar to Apache Pig, but Highways, it's almost like SQL only. Okay. Tez, which is at the same level at MapReduce. So it's an alternative to MapReduce, and nowadays Hive is used with Tez to increase the performance. So with Hive plus Tez, you can get more speed than Hive plus MapReduce. And what Tez does, that it creates a acyclic graph of your data, what you are trying to query. So it tries to create a acyclic graph of all the queries you want to do and maintains that. So, and then executes it in the way by understanding the data, what steps are you taking and how to do that. Details we can go into later. I also haven't gone into very details of how it works. In an abstract way, the main KPI of Tez is that it forms a acyclic graph between the elements you are trying to query, and because of that, sometimes it can be 10 times faster than MapReduce. Okay, Apache Pig can also run with the Tez. Okay. Coming to Mesos, it's an alternative to Yarn. Okay, it also does the same things which Yarn does, but in some different way. So there are definitely pros and cons of using Mesos and using Yarn, and in different situations, people can choose to use Yarn or Mesos. Okay, Spark. Spark is very, in the current world, very highly rated technology for big data. This can run on Yarn and this can run on Mesos also, and it gives you a programmatical way to run. I mean, as you see, it is at the same level of MapReduce, so it gives you a programmatic way of running your MapReduce jobs over the big files which are stored on HDFS. Apache Spark has grown into, it can handle this real-time data also with Spark streaming. Okay, it can with MLlibs, it can do the machine learning also, and machine learning on the real-time data also. So Spark is quite exciting. It has grown into a lot of features which which counter to the current world problems. HBase is basically a NoSQL data store, which gives a option to open your data, which is stored on HDFS, to transactional processing. So, I mean, you can imagine like some OLTP operations or OLTP tasks. So, HBase gives you a very fast way of doing that because it's a NoSQL columnar database. Okay, and this is a very good way to expose your data to OLTP systems. Coming to this Apache Storm, I mean, we know what Apache Storm is. It's basically real-time processing. Okay, and this also works with works on the data on a real-time basis, and it can store in the HDFS. So Storm is basically for the real-time processing of your data. Okay. Moving on here, I mean, I'm coming onto this side. This Oozie basically gives you a mechanism to run scheduled jobs. So, for example, you have a steps of things to do, like you have to save a data on the HDFS, then run a Hive query to fetch the data, and then try to feed that data into Spark streaming or Storm, and then get the output. So these are various steps of data steps of processing which you need to perform, and Oozie gives you a way to schedule those things. Okay, Zookeeper, it's a cluster manager, resource manager, and it's been used by most of the technologies present in this ecosystem. Okay, to handle the cluster, handle the nodes. So it's been very extensively used. Okay, uh, coming on this data ingestion part. Okay, so data ingestion basically helps you to get data inside your HDFS. So Scoop is a way to convert your relational data. I mean, it gives a medium to connect your relational data to save data on HDFS. Okay, Flume is basically gives a mechanism to uh, ingest your logs, basically web logs or some processing logs, generating at a quite high speed. Those can be pushed into HDFS using Flume. Kafka, we all know it also does the similar things, but the ways are different. So it can be used to stream data into HDFS or getting some data from somewhere, doing some transformation, and then pushing data to the HDFS. So Kafka is also there. Ambari is at the top, and it provides a management kind of a portal or management kind of a system where you can manage all the things which are present here, including your file system. You can look for your MapReduce task. You can check with the TES. So I have been using it. I mean, if you guys want, you can check out this Hortonworks data platform. It's a Docker container. You can check it out, and you can open the Ambari UI, and you will get all those things, and you can play around with all these things in the Ambari UI itself. So it's a quite good way of managing and handling everything. It gives you what are the file systems and how the data is stored, and what's the it gives you full monitoring of your data blocks and storage systems also. Okay, so this actually forms the core ecosystem of Hadoop. There are many other things like Mahout, other machine learning things, but they are not that tightly coupled with the Hadoop native. In fact, they are more tightly coupled with one of these things. So I have kept it out of it. Okay, so this basically forms the Hadoop core ecosystem, and then there is another part to it, which is the external data storage. So your data can be at somewhere else, and this MySQL. So I mean, as I said earlier, also this Scoop is used to convert relational data and push data into HDFS. So Scoop with MySQL can do to and fro between your HDFS file system and MySQL. So data can be reside on MySQL and can be used as HDFS, and in the other way around also. Cassandra and MongoDB would be similar to HBase. Okay, they are also NoSQL databases, and yeah, so they provide very fast processing for OLTP transaction based things. Okay, so yeah, this is about the external data storage, and then the third part are the query engines. So there are many query engines which can be used. Here are the few: Apache Drill, Presto, Phoenix, Who, and Apache Zeppelin. Apache Drill gives you a mechanism to write SQL queries on your NoSQL data. Okay. Apache Phoenix is similar, but it goes beyond that, and it gives you a mechanism to write queries on any kind of data stores. It can be NoSQL or anywhere. Okay, Presto is another query engine to query data from your file system. I assume we will be discussing it in coming up sessions. So all these things basically are the different systems to query data out of Hadoop. Okay, so this actually forms the whole, I mean, as per me, the world of Hadoop. There are many other things which, I have to keep it out because they are more indirectly connected to these things. But I mean, I feel this is what actually becomes the world of Hadoop in my sense. Okay, so that is all for from me on Hadoop ecosystem. I tried to keep it short as possible. Yeah. Any questions? Hello.
Go for it.
No.
I'm good
No.
for me.
Yeah, me too.
Okay. Okay,
Thank
then
you.
thank you.